Hi, for those of you who are joining, we're getting ready to start in a couple of minutes. We've got a really wonderful guest here, Randy Milch. We'll give you another 30 seconds or so to hop on. Looks like a number of people joining. So once we see the rate level off, then we'll get started. So thanks for spending some time with us today, and we'll get started shortly. Thanks. So Randy, I usually use the popcorn algorithm for deciding when to start. I watch the participants join, and when it looks like the popcorn's popping a little bit less frequently, then we go ahead and get started. Looks like still a few people joining, but why don't we go ahead and get started? We got a 30-minute period here, and I want people to have a chance to get to know you and to learn from you. But let me just intro by saying you've had an amazingly distinguished career. I've long admired your work, and I love the fact that we can work together now at NYU. You have so many titles at NYU, I don't even know where to start, but you co-chair the Center for Cybersecurity where I work, so in Accenture, my boss there. And you and I both work really hard on the cybersecurity risk and strategy program. That's something I know that you're very passionate about and that we spend a lot of time on. But you know, I think most people also know that you spent many years over at Verizon as the general counsel and working public policy. So that certainly colors your career. But I want to thank you for taking a half an hour and spending time with a lot of students and prospective students here. And I really appreciate you making some time.
Ed, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah,
it's a real pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to do anything with you because you bring such a huge swath of information and knowledge to the problem that I always end up learning a boatload. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity.
Well, we're going to try and learn from you today. I'll see if we can pick your brain on a bunch of different things. But first, our favorite thing to start with is maybe have you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your journey, you know, to, you've traveled through some positions that people could only dream to reach. What were some of the things that got you there? Tell us a little bit about your career and your journey.
You know, everyone's journey is a little bit different. And my own, you're looking at a guy who, when he got out of college, was absolutely positive he never wanted to be a lawyer. And so, you know, ended up though, the only job I could find after the Reagan Revolution in 1980 was as a paralegal. And about 6 months into being a paralegal, I looked around and saw lawyers earning 10 times what I was earning. I was earning the princely sum of $14,000 a year, 10 times what I was earning, and they certainly didn't seem to have a corner on knowledge. So I went to my boss and I said, "What's with this pay disparity?" And he said, "You need the sheepskin, buddy. If you want to earn lawyer money, you should go be a lawyer." So I went to law school. Was a litigator for quite some time. You know, in private practice, became a partner at a law firm, and one day got a call from the then Bell Atlantic. This was in 1993, and thought, "Oh my God, I just landed this huge client. you know, my life is made." And unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, the answer from Bell Atlantic was, "No, we want you to litigate a case that's too important to entrust to someone who's on the outside. You have to quit your partnership and come work in-house for us." And luckily, I have a very wise wife who said, "You'll probably, you know, there are issues you've always had with being in private practice, and I do have issues with private practice. It just doesn't really make any sense as a business model. Instead, you know, go in-house." And it turned out to be the great decision. And you remember back in those days, 1993, it was just the dawn of the deregulatory boom, and somehow ended up with that as a little bit of a lift under my wings. Went to Bell Atlantic, became Verizon eventually, and and I eventually became general counsel, and eventually cybersecurity fell into my ambit because I was the guy who went to the CEO in 2008 and said, you know, we're lucky and not good. We need to do something about this. And the CEO did what CEOs usually do, which was simply to say, you brought it up, you fix it. So that's how I ended up with cybersecurity back in 2008, when it was a little less sexy in the outside world. It was sexy for those people working it, but it was a little less sexy in the outside world back in 2008.
So what was the big sort of trigger in 2008 that caused you to, you know, go to the boss and say, oh, we've got an issue? Was it one thing, or was it some growing number of things that crossed some threshold?
It was really a growing number of things, you know, and as always, it's really important to listen to the people who work with you. You know, I had a lawyer who I became general counsel, and he had been in and out of my group at various times. He was the guy who I entrusted and who had previously been entrusted with negotiating the IT contracts, right? The huge, massive contracts that Verizon had with IBM and all these massive IT contracts. And he had a CS degree. And he had a master's in CS, and he came to me and he said, you know, we're doing all this, we just spent $1 billion on this contract, and we have no security. We're inherently insecure. And I said, really? You were not buying security with the contract? I mean, we're paying them so much money. And he said, no, that's not the way it works. So that was like, okay. And it was, and so I went into a deep dive with him for a month, where he schooled me on cybersecurity and what was the problem. And once I sort of cracked the code from you know, I know just enough telecom engineering, Ed, to be dangerous, right? Because I litigated it for years during the deregulatory days. So I like to say that I've been lied to by more engineers than almost any person in the United States, right? All the time. I was litigating how we got into long distance, so we had to break apart the network and put it back together and give it to people, and the OS associated with it. So once I figured out what we were looking at and how fractured we were, you know, Verizon had a legacy landline business. We had a growing exponentially wireless business, which of course thought it was the cat's meow on every issue. And we had our international business, right? And we were so disjointed. We had marketing that had servers with marketing agencies. We had salespeople that every time someone wanted a server, they would call up the IT department. The IT department would give them a server, and they'd stick it in a closet somewhere. Yeah. A company the size of Verizon, just figuring out what your landscape looks like is a huge job. So that's what happened. And when I figured it out, in the sense of not as you would figure it out, but as a lay person like I would figure it out, it just scared the hell out of me. So that's why I went to the CEO.
That's makes perfect sense. Now I'm going to ask you a question here. You're uniquely qualified to give some thoughts on this, but this kind of thing a lot of people, you know, ponder and don't really know. It has to do with nation state. And I'm pretty sure that when you first started looking at this in 2008, you probably had the team explaining, and you probably knew already, that it wasn't just hackers, but it was big, scary nation states coming at a private company. Now, everything you know about the law and certainly cyber, I mean, you and I work together, it's sort of that intermingling of policy and law and cyber. And so what's the deal with this? I mean, just about every other aspect of our world, like if bombers came and dropped physical bombs on Verizon, you guys would be screaming for the military to help, and they would come. Why is it? And this is an open-ended question. I don't know the answer to this one, so I don't expect that you have the answer in a box somewhere. But I'm just curious, when you think about that, given your experience and your vantage point, what's the right thing for us to think about here when nation states are going after private companies?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question, as you would imagine. So I tend to break it down into a few steps. just for ease of trying to keep track of it and trying to come up with a sort of a systematic way to think about it.
Yeah.
You know, it's to everyone's benefit to have a concept of when you call in the military that is limited in some respect, right? You don't want military action taken at every insult, at every minor thing that might happen. And so much of what happens in the world, you know, listen, is even in the scheme of what a nation state would do to a private company, there's lots of gradations about what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the equivalent of dropping a bomb on a central office and destroying property and lives all the time. So there's a wide variation, and it's in everyone's interest to sort of take a deep breath and not call everything an act of war, which would tend to get the juices flowing and demand sort of some set of responses. It's to everyone's benefit to have a gray area. In other words, to have an area that's between some sort of a cyber action that would cripple multiple waterworks and lead to death, to a cyber action where it could be simply espionage, right? Espionage is not necessarily a bad thing. It tends to let the party that's spying on the other party get some better ideas about what their intentions are, which frequently means you're not going to go to war, right? You have a better idea what's happening. You can respond in different ways. So I tend to go for a high bar on what is an act of war. You know, I tend to think that, you know, there's a lot of theft that goes on. That's a very principal item that we have, of course, with the Chinese state cyber efforts is theft of IP. There are ways to combat that. You know, the truth of the matter is the United States, as a hugely IP-rich, you know, country that develops so much stuff, it's like Willie Sutton, right? Where else are they going to go to steal stuff if not come to us? We're the ones who have it. So I tend to sort of think that we've got to have gradations. I tend to sort of think that some of the theory that's come about recently about forward positioning on other folks' networks by the government is probably a good idea, sort of fills a little bit of that gap. And, you know, this is still something very much in development. I think one last thing, Ed, and you probably share this feeling, you know, the last thing a private company with massive networks wants to do is say, call in the government and say, come help me.
Right. No, that's
I mean,
true.
that would send shivers down your spine as you're running AT&T's networks and the Secret Service shows up and says, or Homeland Security shows up and says, let me tell you how to do this, right? You would, no way.
That might require a couple of packs of Tums when that happens. But, you know, one of the topics that our students, our master's students, debate all the time and that we talk to them about are kind of the legal consequences when these things happen, right? When there's like a compliance framework that lays out something that might have, you know, say post-attack incident response requirements, and there could even be some punitive damages if, you know, if a lot of credentials are lost. What do you think there? And again, this is giving people a little window in the kinds of things that we talk about with our students, but it always feels like, for me as former CISO, I always felt like we got beat up and maybe even got fired when we were involved in a fight that may not have been fair from the beginning. You know, that
yeah, well,
you know what I mean? It seems unfair somehow.
Yeah, of course, we both know that life's unfair, and it's particularly unfair for which doesn't mean they shouldn't become CISOs, because I think that they have an unbelievable opportunity to affect the way we deal with things. So it's a very important job that I heartily recommend the best people go do. You know, it's a commonplace in cybersecurity to say that a lot of our regulators, and we have a very weird regulatory scheme here in the United States that we like to poke fun at, and whether it's the best, it's probably not the best one. Whether it's better than others is a different question than whether it's the best one. There's a common theme that the regulators like to, after a cyber event, what they really like to do is go on the field of battle and shoot the wounded, right? I mean, that's one way to think about what the regulators do, and it's a little bit what you're saying. We get, the businesses get beat up immensely after the fact. They're pretty much forced to settle at very high prices. Actual injury is a much different concept. If you look at actual injury from many breaches, the really high value injury where someone's identity is stolen and it's really difficult to get that back and the like is a relatively small percentage of what happens in most cases. So this whole question of the best way for our whole regulatory scheme, and I like to think of regulatory as all of the rules, all of the rules of general application, of specific application, ranging from lawsuits to corporate rules to whatever, all form pressures on entities that will push them one way or the other in their cybersecurity posture, right? Corporations are like any other entity. It's largely a corporate problem in the United States, but it's also a government problem, obviously, which has its own set of issues. But you got to look at the incentives, and the incentives are hugely varied. And trying to figure out what the right incentives are to tell a company you need to invest more in cybersecurity is pretty difficult, because there's lots of countervailing pressures on companies, right, that are important.
Yeah, definitely true. I'm going to want to ask you in a couple minutes about your work at NYU and what attracted you to academia. But before that, I can't resist asking a couple questions about Washington. So more about the trends. Like you've had a broad perspective over a number of different, say, administrations. What do you think? Are the people there, are they kind of getting it better? Are they attracting maybe better people to government, or any other trends? I know you and I see a lot of federal government employees coming to our programs. It seems like a lot of them recognizing the importance of cyber. But I'm curious if you think maybe whether you're optimistic that maybe the folks that quote unquote work in positions in Washington understand cybersecurity and related policy issues, or if you think maybe it's getting worse. I'm interested in what you see.
Well, I'd also be interested in what you think, but I think that, I think that from what I can tell, we have been able to attract to the core cyber positions, right? Yeah. The core sort of policy positions and the core sort of investigatory regulatory positions in DHS, in NSA, in a few other places. Good people. I think that those people are, I admire those people. They work really hard, and I think that they, by and large, get it. And they, by and large, get it because many of them have had a lot of varied experiences. Part of the problem we face when we talk about government and we talk about regulation in particular is that, folks whose only job has been in the government have a particular outlook about the way the rest of the world is supposed to react to government, and they have a relatively little understanding of what makes the rest of the economy tick, right, as a general matter. But if you have people with differing experiences coming in, going out, that's very valuable, because I think that they need to understand the object of their regulation, right, what it is that's going to make a company do the right thing, right? So other than simply saying, oh, we're going to find the bejesus out of you, right? I mean, that's one way to get attention, but it's usually not the best way to get attention, right? I think as you go outward, every agency is supposed to have its own cyber posture, right? Its own CISO. Those CISOs don't report to the head CISO of the government. They report into somebody. So I always pick on the Small Business Administration. I don't know why. I assume that it's a great place with great people, but the notion that the CISO of the Small Business Administration, who reports to the head of the Small Business Administration, is going to be able to do a job that's the same as a better financed agency that's going to care about it a little more, I tend to have my doubts, right? So organizational structure and those things are all very important. And by the way, that was not a dig at the CISO of the Small Business Administration, who for all I know is tremendous.
But I think you're right. I sense that in surgical sort of positions where you need someone at CISA or at one of these agencies where you've got an important capability, they seem better to me than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They're more capable, better trained, and they're underpaid and overworked. They take a lot of grief. So I'm pretty optimistic when I look at the people who are experts. But what worries me is I think you still have a general malaise amongst, say, members of Congress who seem still not to get it. Still a lot of Luddite conversation. You and I have both had the experience that often when you pass through that trust gauntlet where the staffers decide they're going to trust you and you get access to that senator or congressman and they want to talk cyber, you realize how little they understand. It's quite shocking to me. And that's true. That's true in 2020 as it was 20 years ago. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. And maybe that brings me to your present career. I mean, is that maybe one of the things that attracted you to come back to NYU to help train the next generation of leaders? Because we don't train kids in our program. We train people who are practitioners. So tell us about what attracted you to academia.
So, it's interesting, Ed, because actually the master's program that you and I both work on, that I think we both feel very passionate about, which is just has worked, I think, really well to attract professionals in for an additional degree that they get over the course of a year. If you trace the origins back, it goes back to 2016, the year after I came back to NYU. When I came back to NYU, I only wanted to talk about two things. One was cybersecurity and one was national security, because my own view is that telecom law shouldn't exist and everyone said, oh, you can talk about telecom law. I said, I don't want to talk about that. It shouldn't even exist. So I was asked if I would teach a cybersecurity course. And I said, only if I could do it with a professor from Tandon, because in the real world, lawyers don't solve cybersecurity problems and engineers don't fix cybersecurity problems. They fix them together, right? If there's a crisis, the teams come together. And my idea was, if I could find someone at Tandon to teach this with me, we could get engineering students and law students in the same class and teach them together and make sure we sort of raise the literacy level for both. And that's what turned into the master's program. So, I think that getting that training, it's become sort of a labor of love. I really enjoy the interaction we have. We have such talented people coming in that, heck, they could teach the class, right? And our job sort of turns into funneling their expertise in particular ways so they make sure they explore all the issues that they're going to cover, right? So, I think that it really was the attraction of being able to do this together with both law and engineering at the same time, which, by the way, is sort of the secret sauce that we have at NYU that you really don't find many other places. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I've looked at the master's programs, the straight sort of masters of cybersecurity programs from engineering schools, and I can't find one where you're actually required, when you get your master's in cyber, you're actually required to take a policy or law course. Right?
True.
So,
true. I'll tell you, when I first found out about the program, Nasser Memon called and said, we need somebody to do the intro summer course last year. And when I saw the student mix, I was terrified in the beginning. I thought, wow, this is not the usual gearhead engineers that I can get in front of and we can go through stuff. These are people who have some pretty impressive positions. And it was an experience last year. I'm doing it again this summer, and I love it because I know that the conversations in many cases are just as good as the lectures. Sometimes I prepare a lecture and I get through 20% of it because there's so many interesting conversation that goes on that it's really quite interesting. So now that you've been kind of embedded in all of this, I want to ask you just a general question about education in general. You and I and others have talked a lot about like this idea of continuous, like lifelong sort of learning. What do you think about when, and I know NYU talks about this a lot, this idea that you and I, when we went to school, you put 4 years in, you popped out, and there's your education. Then you go to law school, or I went and did my computer science work. You did that and then you were done. That seemed the way you did it when we did education. Then you went and got a job. You know, that was it. You did school. It seems like the world has changed, hasn't it? Like it's not this, you do education, then you do something else. There's this idea of lifelong learning. I'm curious what you think about that. Whether if you were back at Verizon, you know, I was back at AT&T, I have a feeling those would be topics that would be pretty, you know, top of mind. And I'm curious what you think now in your vantage point about this idea of lifelong commitment to learning.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I think we both had the experience, I know I did as a lawyer, of the requirement for continuing legal education to keep your skills up, right?
Yeah.
And for years it was a joke. I mean, for years
you
it was
roll
a
your
joke.
eyes, totally roll your eyes. Yeah.
Oh, you'd go to a conference somewhere, and you'd sit in a panel, or you'd sit in the room for the morning, and then you're expected to go play golf or something in the afternoon, right? And it was ludicrous, right? And then when I became responsible for 400 lawyers at Verizon, and I saw what I said, okay, now I'm really responsible for this. I said, we're not doing this way anymore. You know, you're not going to, you know.
No more golf.
No more golf, right? It's not happening anymore. So I do think that the thing that's great is the business that has grown up around being able to allow you to continually learn, right? These boxes that we're talking into are the most spectacular learning tool if it's done well, right? Your Coursera courses, the stuff we're doing, I mean, they're so easy to learn from. And I think that it's the synergy you get, because this has turned out to be great. Now listen, there's plenty of crap online, right? There's plenty of stuff that is hard to understand, it's not taught well, it assumes stuff that people don't know, and all sorts of things. But the good stuff online is so good, is so clear, is such a great way to, you know, improve your skills, that I'm all for it. I think that it's an opportunity that everyone ought to be taking advantage of.
That's good to hear. We've got some questions here I'm going to pass along to you. Ankit is asking, and this is a great question, he's asking, for those of us who are engineers, count me one of them, what can we do to help lawyers better understand cybersecurity? There's some things we should be doing. And I'll sort of append my own point. Do you think we should be changing the way we describe things? Or do you think maybe we should do something different? What do you think?
I think that it mostly is about, honest to goodness, it's about intention more than anything else, because I can't tell you the number of times in my experience as a working lawyer with engineers, if the engineer felt threatened in the situation, you immediately got into engineering gobbledygook, and there was no intention to try to help. Same thing was true the other way, by the way. If the lawyer felt threatened in the situation, all of a sudden it was lawyer gobbledygook and nothing succeeded. So it's really the most important thing that an engineer could do is want to help the lawyer get to a place, right? Get to understand, get to a place, and be incredibly open and honest, and be willing to say the same thing 3 times because the first 2 times didn't make any sense to the lawyer. In my experience, Ed, having mixed classes of engineers and lawyers in the class, it's a lot easier to teach an engineer about law and policy than it is to teach a lawyer about engineering. Simply because most of the engineers I've met are very smart, they're very ordered, they have they absorb the rules, they go logically along, which is about 80% of being a lawyer. The other side, the lawyers a lot of them became lawyers because they were scared of math, right? So they tend to freeze up when someone starts, leading them through the logic tree that you need to do for some aspects of cyber. So I think that engineers actually in many ways can contribute a lot to this, because the only thing they're going to lack in the legal training is they're not going to get the ability, they're not going to get legal judgment, right? In order to get legal judgment, you have to make a lot of legal mistakes and learn from them, and you're just not going to have that process. So I think the engineers can be a great effort if what they believe they need to do is help the lawyers along, so that the lawyers, instead of being dogmatic about what the legal rule is, get the benefit of the technology to understand how to move everyone forward. And that's the critical item.
Daniel is asking, is there a good way for lawyers to become less fearful of the technology? And I think our program is one example of that. I think continuing education probably is not a terrible idea for working attorneys. No,
I think it's a great, and I think that, there's lots of stuff out there about cyber. Some of it's very repetitive, and some of it's really about privacy, which is different than cyber, in my view. But there are great classes out there. Our master's course, there's stuff online that is very clear. Starting to get the grounding of how a computer works, and that stuff like that is critical. How networks work. You don't need to do all the math in order to get a reasonable working knowledge about what you're talking about, right? You'll never be an engineer, but understanding how networks work and how the protocols work, it sort of tells you right away, oh my God, we have a problem here that's embedded in the internet. We better think about it as, we better move along and think about it some other ways. So I think that going online and looking for things like your Coursera courses or our master's degree course really will help a lawyer gain literacy that will make them a much more useful partner to the engineers in the company and the other folks in the company as they try to struggle with the incredible question of how much money are we going to spend on cybersecurity, which is the tough question.
I would agree. Well, I'll tell you what, Randy, I think I could sit for 4 hours and listen to you. We should probably get your own podcast here and let you share. But on behalf of all of us listening, all the participants, I want to thank you for, answering some tricky questions. And a couple of those questions I think were answered maybe better than I've ever heard before. Certainly that gray area. I love that concept. That's right on the money. So I hope that for those of you listening, I know there are a lot of prospective students here. I hope you'll consider our programs at NYU. We'd love to have you. Randy, I think you and I both, Northeasterners, I think there's some nice advantages to New York City and to Brooklyn and to the Northeast. I hope people will come by and visit us and stop by and say hello to you as well.
That would be a pleasure. And Ed, thank you very much for having me on. Anytime you want to talk, I'm here for you.
Well, we're going to do another batch later in the year. We'll probably bring you back for part 2. I think there's so much more to talk about.
Great. Have a good one. Everyone stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.